Very good evening, good day, everyone, and welcome to this discussion with India Health Fund, hosted by Vadvani Research Center for Bioengineering. It is my pleasure to host Mr. Madhav Joshi of India Health Fund on our discussion today. IHF, as many of you probably know, is a Tata Trust Initiative, and it was set up in 2017 as a not-for-profit to fund and de-risk the development of science and technology-based innovations for communicable diseases. And I understand that the mandate today is a bit more broad-based in terms of not just covering communicable diseases, but screening and diagnostics in general, as well as digital health technologies. IHF also develops partnerships in India and other developing countries to scale these solutions, and also develops financing mechanisms for their deployment and scaling. Mr. Madhav Joshi, of course, needs no introduction. He has had a long and storied career in healthcare. He currently leads IHF, a position he has held for the past 4+ years. I look forward to having an engaging discussion with him this evening on diverse aspects of healthcare ecosystem in India, particularly aspects relating to deep tech research coming out of Indian academia, addressing some of the deep technology gaps in the healthcare ecosystem and other aspects around it. So without further ado, I would invite Mr. Madhav Joshi to share a few comments about his own career and what brought him to IHF eventually, and his views on what needs to be done in addressing some of the gaps that are there in the healthcare ecosystem, particularly from the technology and financing perspective. Madhav.
Thank you, Abdur, and thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be part of this conversation. Look, my background is not your typical technology incubation for public health. I started my career in the private sector after going to business school, and I worked with Nestle for over 20 years in various commercial roles all around the world. Including a fairly long and impactful and eye-opening stint in Africa, where I was responsible for setting up a Nestle business covering 19 countries, where Nestle didn't have much of a presence earlier. I think that was my first direct engagement with the opportunity to bring cutting-edge science or science-based solutions to address challenges in underprivileged or underserved communities. And that was from the point of view of bringing higher quality nutrition and better quality nutrition to children who are not really, in many cases, getting access to it. And I think that was not only a great learning experience, but a very fulfilling experience for me personally, because I really learned about the challenges a commercial organization that is mandated to make a profit and is accountable to its shareholders for a profit, but also wants to do the right thing by using its not just capabilities, but multiple strengths as a force for good. And that was a dichotomy that wasn't easily addressed. And I think where we landed was on 3 areas. One was really insights-based solutions, which were grounded in local considerations. And that's something that stayed with me. I think the second thing was, it's not good enough to just develop something that looks great and cool and which can do a lot. The rubber really hits the road when you need to start reaching people. And that's where 80% of the challenges in heavy lifting lie. The third thing was there is a very clear role for the private sector. There are some things that the private sector cannot do on its own. And the private sector has great capabilities in research, in production, in distribution, particularly in challenging settings. The private sector is not designed to provide subsidies. The private sector is not designed to really undertake the kind of community-based activities that particularly health and nutrition need. And I'm just sharing some of these learnings from, I think, my experience, certainly working in Africa, and then I moved back to India with Nestle.
Yeah.
And then had the opportunity to take on a role in leading global innovation for a nutrition multinational with a focus on emerging markets. And I was able to bring some of these experiences and learnings, particularly into insights-based identification of opportunities, product design and development, and working with the developers to make sure whatever was being done was not just great for the manufacturing lines, but also relevant for the people we were aiming to uh, really deliver improved quality for. And there is that tension because what is good from a manufacturing efficiency point of view is not necessarily the right thing for patients and customers. So I think providing the translation of a customer need into a development requirement and getting the two to understand each other was very important, and particularly the developers to understand. And I think that was really the journey that brought me to India Health Fund with experience also then having worked in pharma after that, which was there is a clear role for science, innovation, and technology. And the private sector does a heck of a lot, if I can, and I think we must give them that credit. But the private sector is not designed to deliver for the more marginal communities who are not served. And I think that's where the intersection between my experience and what India Health Fund was set up to do came in. And it's been the last 4 years, as you mentioned, have been really setting up and developing the organization, the journey, and the mandate, and it's been very fulfilling.
Awesome, super. I think it's also interesting that you have navigated the spectrum from child nutrition, which sort of is the inception of everything. I mean, there was a recent report on the child wasting and child malnourishment, stunted growth in the country. And I was invited to a forum. I made a mention. There's a lot of emphasis on building schools and beyond a certain point, but a good 80%, 90% of the neural development, mental development happens below the age of 5, where you see a huge amount of undernutrition. So, I think 80% of our resources should be deployed because otherwise you're chasing a moving goal after that critical window of 5 years is missed. Very interesting. Also, Madhav, at India Health Fund, I know even when it comes to health and disease, India, among a few other countries, occupies a space where both NCDs and CDs, the burden is going up, non-communicable as well as communicable. From the India Health Fund perspective, how do you balance which one is more priority?
Sure. So, like I was saying, there's no question of prioritizing communicable or non-communicable diseases over each other. They've got equal uh, relevance for all patients. But to go back to the origins of India Health Fund, Tata Trusts, when the SDGs were announced, Tata Trust took the view that achieving the elimination goals, particularly for infectious diseases, would be very challenging, relying only on programmatic approaches, given where the incidence was and where elimination needed to be within a fairly short period of time. And the trusts, science and technology was identified as a potential disruptor, which could help improve the ability of programs to get the discontinuity that was needed, both in diagnosis, access to treatment, and prevention. But the related hypothesis at the trust was that market failure had prevented the development of meaningful science and technology-based solutions for infectious diseases. And that was very different from what the case was for non-communicable diseases. where big investments have been made in diagnostics and therapeutics and adherence solutions, among others, which have had a significant impact in improving access to care as well as prevention, as well as, and of course, patient outcomes across the entire gamut of non-communicable diseases. The same science potential exists for infectious diseases, but it never been really actuated because over time, these had become diseases that affected people in developing countries, funded largely by governments and not-for-profits. So there wasn't enough return for the private sector to make the investments that were needed for the returns they required.
Got it.
And I think that's the difference between solutions for communicable and non-communicable diseases. So you see a lot more affordable, accessible, and very effective uh, diagnostics, therapeutics, and the like for, in fact, non-communicable diseases.
Yeah.
So that's what led Tata Trust to conceive India Health Fund as a catalytic fund, which would use patient capital by way of grants to be catalytic in a few different ways. So one was provide the funding that was needed and not available to enable the development, the validation of new tools, and be catalytic in de-risking these tools because nobody was willing to put that money down to really enable the tools. The second area of being catalytic is to then catalyze the adoption and scale up of these tools, not necessarily using our own resources all the time, but to then facilitate like-minded public and private sectors to really adopt these based on the evidence which comes from the funding we provide. And that is the third area, really being catalytic, which is to create collaborations and collaboratives of like-minded players to really facilitate this entire effort. Obviously catalyzed by what Tata Trust has, I think, with a very forward-thinking approach, considered in conceiving India Health Fund. And this is way before infectious diseases became top of mind with COVID.
Absolutely.
So I think that's why we prioritize infectious diseases, not because they have a higher health risk or a greater priority, but because it's an area which lacks sufficient funding. And that's where we choose to deploy the capital that we have available through Tata Trusts.
So it's sort of neglected from the commercial interest perspective of the infectious disease space.
Well, I wouldn't say neglected, but I'd say a lower priority.
Got it. Got it.
Because private capital always goes to where the best
The margins are better.
The margins are better. Absolutely.
Yeah. And would you say that you have sort of repositioned India Health Fund in a sense that to call it now broad-based screening and diagnostics as opposed to use case-based communicable or non-communicable, or am I mistaken to think that it's very much still a communicable disease-based approach?
So I think North Star remains communicable diseases.
Yeah.
And we will never stray from that. But what we've done a lot of, and I think we'll continue to do, is instead of being disease focused, we like to take what we call a platform focused approach.
Yeah.
Where we like platforms enabled by deep science or deep tech, which we can support for their application in areas of relevance or priority for us, which are communicable diseases. But very often these platforms are also equally relevant for NCDs.
Yeah.
And seeing this, especially in the case of digital technologies. So AI algorithms that we have funded for to read chest X-rays for, say, tuberculosis and for COVID.
Yeah.
Adapted to also read chest X-rays to screen for lung cancer.
Nice.
So it's really a lung health tool. Similarly, AI algorithms that we funded for to read cough sounds. Again, for tuberculosis are also being adapted to detect COPD and asthma.
Mm.
And I think becoming very handy early warning tools to identify lung health conditions, particularly in the context of areas with high air pollution. So I would say we've repositioned India Health Fund as a player in diagnostics. I would say we've, I think, sharpened our focus
Yeah.
uh, on platforms which have wider application. And we've taken big bets in decentralized point of care screening and in funding the development of decentralized point of care diagnostics, screening tools, and digital tools,
Mhm.
which address a wider spectrum of requirements from surveillance to screening to diagnosis and treatment adherence. So that's the way we're looking at it.
Which also makes sense from the fundamental technology perspective, because whether it is communicable NCD or CD, the biology doesn't care. It, it's simply trying to detect a nucleic acid here or a protein there or something like that. So from a platform perspective, it doesn't matter what the application is, right?
That's a good way of putting it.
Right. So my next question, Madhav, is how do you see climate change? I know with climate change, it is anticipated that communicable diseases, there will be a surge in such, and antibiotic resistance will also increase. How does that factor into your prioritization and going forward for you?
Well, it's the sad reality of our times that it's climate change has now started affecting just about every aspect of life, including
Right.
health. And I think what we'd seen coming for a long time was many of the areas that we were already working on were all climate sensitive. So whether it was vector-borne diseases or, as you mentioned, climate and AMR, or even lung conditions,
Mhm.
all affected by different aspects of climate change. So for us, it hasn't been a revolution.
Mhm.
Uh, what it's allowed us to do is, first of all, make sure that the work that we are already doing um, is relevant not just in a disease uh, detection or treatment context, but a lot of these tools are very useful or very relevant to help health systems adapt to the impact of climate change. So I think the way we are approaching it is we stay true to our purpose.
Mhm.
But instead of just focusing on the clinical development of solutions, which is what we've done so far, we're also making sure that they are relevant in climate affected contexts and among communities who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in those areas. So, if I could put a face to it, uh, we funded an AI based uh, uh, surveillance system which uses a series of small sensors which are put up in different parts of the city. The sensors read the wing beat frequencies of mosquitoes.
Mhm.
Algorithms have been trained to detect species based on the wing beat frequency, and each species carries a different
Amazing.
piece. So, for the first time, uh, there is the possibility of getting real-time updates on mosquito concentrations so that both vector control as well as breeding control can happen
Amazing.
in a
Yeah.
hyper-local way, but also more effectively because there's no need to spray and play anymore.
Yeah.
Right. Now, this was developed from the point of view of better vector surveillance. But we realized as we were developing this, we realized two things. One, changing vector activity was also an indicator of climate change hotspots. So the longitudinal data from this kind of surveillance, which is now available continuously, can provide early warning signals. And overlaid with climatic data, whether it's temperature, rainfall, or other aspects, this becomes a great surveillance and decision support system for local authorities. communities. So I think that's a tangible example of how what we were doing in a disease
Yeah.
management context is also relevant in climate affected uh, contexts, albeit with a slightly different focus and a slightly different uh, use case, as well as obviously the need to make sure that it also addresses the needs of communities that may not have been considered in the classical clinical way of designing an intervention. So that's how
Sure,
we're looking
sure.
at climate. It's the same for our work on lung health. And I think we see that in just about everything we do. So our focus on climate is really, or the impact of climate change on health is really to identify use cases where climate change is affecting health in areas where we have some understanding and competence.
Yeah.
And we're funding the evidence of ready tools to demonstrate their effectiveness or the lack of that effectiveness in climate affected contexts and in communities in those areas. So that's how we're approaching our
Got it.
work on climate change. And we're not really straying from our focus on communicable diseases, given that just about every infectious disease is also climate sensitive.
Right. And it's interesting that you mentioned the cross use of the sputum technology that you developed for TB now being used for lung cancer. And I see this particular technology of sensors being used to detect the wind beat frequency have a potential cross application in agriculture, where you have this interaction between crops and pests and how climate change drives that. So that could, again, impact opportunity because this is going to adversely affect small scale farmers too.
In fact, that's a great suggestion. We hadn't thought about it, so we give you full credit for that idea, but we'll certainly take it back to the developer. And this could be a very interesting use case
Absolutely.
as a potential extension. So thank you
Yeah,
for
I
that.
mean, because there is this constant interaction between pests and crops, and that may have a role to play there. And this morning, I was reading a paper, interestingly, which said, which went along the lines of the patient temperature, the fever, the temperature of the fever, because the mutation rates in the microbes are driven by temperature. So we're still talking about external environmental temperature. The body temperature drives the mutation rates as well. So the higher the body temperature, the more drug resistant the bacteria becomes. And the suggestion was we need to manage the body temperature to keep the AMR potentiality low. So lots of interesting research is emerging.
In fact, I think you hit on something very relevant, which is something we've also been keeping an eye on. Unlike, I think, many of the things that we've been working on, where the science is well established,
Mhm.
and it's really now focused on solutioning and solving for those. Uh, the science on the impact of climate change on health is evolving as we speak.
Absolutely.
And that's why we took the view that it would be naive to wait for the science before we start developing tools. So we're taking a two-track approach. One for where there is good, the science is established,
Mhm.
vector-borne diseases, the impact of now air pollution on lung health, for example. Uh, how do we proactively start validating existing tools
Mhm.
so that they can already be available rather than wait? And then there are many areas, such as what you mentioned, where the science is still evolving. We're keeping our ear to the ground on that one and staying close to the research community so that as the evidence evolves, we can proactively then start, if not identifying what already exists, which can be applied, but potentially then consider also supporting the development of new tools. But that always obviously takes a longer time. So it's, I think, two tracks where
Yeah.
work with where the science exists, but also stay close to where the science is evolving.
And part of that could also be the BIRAC IHF joint calls, where you're getting early into the cycle, which is a natural nice segue into my next question to you. A lot of the solutions that you're looking for, whether it be digital health or the sensor-based technology, we are essentially talking deep tech. And institutions like IIT Bombay, ISC, IIT Madras play a big role in the Indian context when it comes to deep tech. And globally, this is also true. Much of deep tech comes from academia. Do you have a strategy in engaging with institutions of higher learning, research institutions to tap into this research early on? Do you go to them with problem statements? At what level? I mean, is it strategic or is it more incidental, this interaction with academia?
Right. Now, good question. Thank you for that. So we work with institutions like the ones you mentioned in a few different ways. One is we have formal partnerships or formal collaborations with many of them uh, for exactly the areas that you mentioned uh, to understand what is the emerging research in terms of basic science. Uh, what is the translational work happening in
Mhm.
labs in these universities, as well as many of them have fantastic incubation centers where some of the best ideas are either housed or coming from.
Mhm.
So we work with them on all three levels to, I think, keep close to not just the science, but the application of the science and emerging solutions, which we've in many cases
Mhm.
been able to support. The second thing we do is, given I think the depth of knowledge and experience in all of our universities, we also engage with the scientists and researchers to help curate both our problem statements as well as to uh, be part of the technical evaluation panels that we set up to have independent, unbiased assessments of all of the projects that we are considering.
Mhm.
And I think that gives us a well rounded perspective of not just the technical possibilities, but then we obviously work with experts who also represent healthcare delivery, and other funders to make sure we get that well rounded view. So I think our partnerships and relationships have been at a number of levels. And at a more tactical level, we've reached out to scientists, research, and experts from who have domain specific experience to advise the projects that we are funding in some cases, wherever they are stuck on, say, a particular aspect of how to develop the microfluidics for a first of its kind rapid antigen test, or uh, to do an independent assessment of the sampling methodology for an AI algorithm, and so on and so forth.
Super. Great, sounds good. Also, who would be an international counterpart for someone like IHF? I'm trying to think of one, but it's hard to think
So,
of one.
so there isn't one. Uh, IHF's the only catalytic fund doing what it does in infectious diseases,
Amazing.
with founded by philanthropy.
Got it.
And that's particularly, I think, what's worth calling out is this is a philanthropy from a developing country using science, technology, and tools from a developing country for developing countries. And Mr. Tata's philosophy has always been India for the world.
Yeah.
Just about everything that we do is relevant not just for India, but for all developing countries. So IHF doesn't have a counterpart anywhere in the world. I think the closest there is Unitate,
Mhm.
which does similar work, but it's a part of WHO.
Right, right. So
And
these are government funded. There's no private philanthropy. I mean, private as in the, like an institutionally funded, philanthropy funded,
no, so Unitate,
right?
yeah, Unitate being part of WHO obviously then has access to WHO's networks, and we have a close and growing relation partnership with them.
Super. So, Madhav, I mean, I know you have a lot of technology. You funded India Health Fund 2017, now roughly about 7, 8 years. You've seen a lot of technologies, maybe two or three that excite you the most. I mean, I love that technology, the one that you mentioned about Beat. The reason is It is a non-chemical, it is not interventional, highly preventive. So if you could do something like that, it's really beautiful, but something that excites you.
So to be honest, everything we do excites me.
I'm
Uh,
sure.
and it excites me not because it's cool, which sometimes some of it actually sounds amazing, but because everything we do has the ability to change people's lives. And as I see it, it brings cutting edge technology from labs that are far removed
Mhm.
from the people who benefit the most from it. And I think that we have the ability to build that bridge between patients and developers and do it in a way that is seamless and I think is what keeps me going and gets me out of bed every morning. So I hesitate to pick one of the projects because honestly, they're all equally exciting and impactful in their own ways. But maybe I'll answer your question in a different way. I think what I find uh, what I'm most optimistic about in what we do is exactly what you said. That we're able. I think we've been able to have an impact in shifting the paradigm from manual uh, invasive approaches
Mhm.
increasingly towards automated, minimally or non-invasive approaches, which are delivering, I think, quality care
Yeah,
closer to patients and in a way that is affordable and equitable. And whether that's being done with our non-invasive AI-based screening tools, the rapid diagnostics that we are, and most of these are all the first of their kind in the world. The surveillance solution that we've just spoken about, or even something that has now become every kid knows RT-PCR. But I think what goes very often unacknowledged is that affordable decentralized RT-PCR started with the work that we did with um, more biodiagnostics and is now, I think, taken on a life of its own. And it's just a process now of continuously making the same PCR device more portable so that eventually it's something that I think the dream is to have something in a pocket, something that you could carry in your pocket. And fortunately, science and technology is moving towards things like that. So I think that's what I would say rather than single out one or two specific projects.
got it.
And
Super.
that's not what you're looking for, but
I know it's hard to name favorites, but that's all I could get out of you. So I'll be happy with it. And coming to the final point, the intended audience for this webinar podcast is scientists, researchers, PhD scholars. People are looking to dive deep into finding solutions to important problems. What is it that you would like to share? I mean, how should they go, particularly for young scientists who are looking for problems to solve? I know that, it seems like a lot of problems have been solved, but you know better, I know better. There are so many problems yet to be solved. What would you like to say to them?
look, I'd like to say a few things. One is, I mean, obviously, everything is grounded in good research. But I think for somebody who really wants to solve a problem, there is the opportunity to go beyond publication.
Mhm.
And publication should be a means to an end rather than an end in itself. And I think the second thing related to that is how do you take theoretical or lab based research into translational work? Because that's really where the magic starts to happen. And to your point, if there is a problem and you've got the science, how do you build the bridge between the science and the solution, the problem and the science?
Yeah.
And I think the point that you brought up a little, I mean, the idea you brought up a little while earlier about how sensors could also be used in uh, agricultural situations. It was a great thought, but I think this is the opportunity that being in a research institution offers, because you have the time, the space, and the ability to think in different directions, and you're encouraged to do that. How do you harness that to looking at different dimensions of problem solving,
Yeah,
not just in a theoretical way, but really bring that forward? And then, and I think the last thing is uh, use available fora to share. And I think the world has changed completely now with digital and social media, and obviously the different ways of engaging and communicating. Uh, there,
yeah,
there are, I think, many ways to now engage, and I would
yeah,
really encourage young scientists to do that, because that is a way of, I think, also not just developing and sharing new ideas, but I think building collaborations and collaborative approaches, to my mind, where science has, again, I think, shown the way a long time. I think there's an opportunity to do more of that, particularly in uh, translational work and maybe cross fertilizing from one area to another.
right. So, I mean, I think just to add to it a bit, I think once people begin to specialize, um, they begin to go deep into something, and sometimes it becomes a man with a hammer syndrome. I think the trick here is to zoom in and zoom out. For instance, one of the technologies that you and I were excited about today is about malaria, but it has nothing to do with drugs and it has nothing to do with needles. It has something to do with a sensor monitoring a mosquito. It's a very outside the box approach. Another one that I mentioned from my reading was just managing the body temperature of the patient. Nothing, again, nothing to do with a new drug or nothing like that for AMR. I think we need more such because and I think this type of lateral thinking comes from speaking to multifaceted people. Because in your domain, you tend to go deeper and deeper. The like-minded, it becomes an echo chamber. But when a scientist steps out and speaks to others, they get a different perspective, and you're not married to a degree, so you start looking at it. I need to solve this problem. I don't care how it is solved, whether it's a hammer or a pick or a shovel, it doesn't matter. I have to solve that problem. I think that view needs to be taken. So as always, Madhav, I can keep going for another 2 hours. It's it never ends in terms of having a good time with you. But thanks again, Sneha, for organizing this session. I would love to do more of this in person. Would love to have you on campus interact with our postdocs, PhDs, and scientists